Theodore Roosevelt came to office at the outset of the progressive movement. This movement was pushed in large part by journalists. People in the United States had long been displeased with the unsafe conditions, political corruption, and social injustice of the industrial age. But it was not until the late 19th century that the spread of cheap newspapers and magazines pushed widespread opposition. Writers directed their criticisms against the trust of oil, beef, and tobacco, prison conditions, exploitation of natural resources, the tax system, the insurance industry, pension practices, and food processing, among others. Theodore Roosevelt, however, became angry when he read a bitter indictment of the political corruption of the day. The president, clearly one of the most fervent reformers, believed that some of the writers were going too far, and called them muckrakers in a speech criticizing the excesses of investigative journalism. The writers, many of whom had been Roosevelt's strongest supporters, harshly criticized him for apparently deserting their cause. The term muckraker, by the way, was taken from the fictional character in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a man who was consigned to rake muck endlessly, never lifting his eyes from his drudgery. Roosevelt compared the journalist to someone stirring up the mud at the bottom of a pond. Public interest in the writings of the muckrakers began to fade around 1910. However, the momentum they created would continue to influence legislation for many more years. Leading writers among the muckrakers were Lincoln Steffens, an investigator of corruption in state and municipal governments, who published Shame of the Cities in 1904, Jacob Riis, who depicted the misery of New York City slums and How the Other Half Lives in 1890, an early advocacy of urban removal. Ida Tarbell wrote a series of magazine articles detailing the business practices of Standard Oil, which appeared in McClure's magazine and later were published in book form as The History of the Standard Oil Company in 1904. And Henry Damaris Lloyd's Wealth Against Commonwealth in 1894 chronicled the rise of John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. The muckrakers had successfully heightened public awareness of safety issues stemming from careless food preparation procedures and the increasing incidence of drug addiction from patent medicines. The experience of American soldiers with so-called embalmed beef during the Spanish-American War added support to the movement. Public pressure forced a reluctant Congress to consider a pure food and drug bill in 1906. Provisions of the measure included the following. 1. Creation of the Food and Drug Administration, which was entrusted with the responsibility of testing all foods and drugs destined for human consumption. 2. The requirement for prescriptions from licensed physicians before a patient could purchase certain drugs. And 3. The requirement of label warnings on habit-forming drugs. Passage of the measure in Congress was not assured. The lobbying association representing the medicine makers was vocal and well-funded, as were representatives of the Beef Trust and other food producers. The active involvement of Roosevelt, who was repulsed by slaughterhouse practices described in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, successfully overcame the lawmakers' reluctance. And what happened was, he read this book. This book was published in 1906, The Jungle by Sinclair, and it was about the meatpacking industry and meatpacking plants in Chicago. And in this book, Sinclair described how they would sweep up everything off the floor, parts of rope, dead animals, anything, sawdust, anything that was there, and that stuff would go into the meat that was processed and then sent out for human consumption. Well, Roosevelt got sick to his stomach when he read this novel, but he thought, well, it's a novel. It can't possibly be true. But then he thought, you know, I'm the president. I probably should send somebody to check this out just to be certain. And so he sent investigators to Chicago to check out those plants. Well, when they came back to Washington, they informed him that the conditions in those plants was even worse than what Sinclair had written about in his book. And so that really pushed Roosevelt for action to make Congress do something to clean up those plants, to clean up the meatpacking industry, and then to also look at what was going on with the drug industry at that time and the patent medicine industry. The first casualty of this legislation was the patent medicine industry. Few of the patent medicines gained certification from the FDA, and part of that was you would have a patent medicine that you could order through the mail or pick up at a local general store, and this medicine might say that it could cure everything from dandruff to cancer, and all you had to do was pay $1, and of course a good portion of it would be like 75% alcohol and not have anything to do with actually trying to quote-unquote cure those diseases. And so most of these medicines, so-called medicines, were bogus, and they didn't pass muster. So once this Pure Food and Drug Act is passed, the patent medicine industry is pretty much going to fade away. Companion legislation, which was centered straight on the meatpacking industry, was the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Both the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act are going to be passed in 1906, the same year as Sinclair's book was published. This act brought the following reforms to the processing of cattle, sheep, horses, hogs, and goats destined for human consumption. All animals were required to pass an inspection by the U.S. Drug Administration prior to slaughter. All carcasses were subject to inspection after slaughter, and cleanliness standards were established for slaughterhouses and processing plants that had never existed before. So you can only imagine the food that was the meat that was coming out of those plants. Roosevelt was the first American president to consider the long-term needs for conservation of national resources. He created the first national bird preserve, the beginning of the wildlife refuge system on Pelican Island in Florida. He urged Congress to establish the United States Forest Service in 1905 to manage government forest lands, and he appointed Gifford Pinchot to head the service. He set aside more land, Roosevelt set aside more land for national parks and natural preserves than all of his predecessors combined, 194 million acres. In all, by 1909, the Roosevelt administration had created an unprecedented 42 million acres of national forest, 53 national wildlife refuges, and 18 acres of special interest, including the Grand Canyon. In 1907, with Congress about to block him, Roosevelt hurried to designate 16 million acres of new national forest. During his presidency, Roosevelt promoted the early conservation movement through articles that he wrote. To Roosevelt, conservation meant more and better usage and less waste and a long-term perspective. He knew that our resources were limited, and that if we didn't start taking better care of them, we were going to lose them. And so this was a man who loved the outdoors. He loved going on hikes. As I had said before, this was a man who had gotten his health back and had become stronger by being in the West, and so he'd become really good friends with a lot of the conservationists, and so he is really going to push to protect our territory and our natural resources. It even went so far as to extend to cause him to forbid having a Christmas tree in the White House, and he was reportedly upset when he found a small tree that had been hidden by one of his sons. But after learning that the industry of commercial farming of the trees, where no forests were cut down to supply the demand during the Christmas holiday, he relented and allowed the family to have a tree each season. So he took this very seriously. He had made one mistake when he was elected on his own, because he had really served most of what would have been McKinley's second term and then was elected again. He felt like that was going to be 2 terms, and so he had announced early on that he would not run for president again in 1908, though he would have been able to. That kind of made him a lame duck president, and he might have gotten even more accomplished had he not made that announcement. And the other thing is that when he left office in 1908, he's still a relatively young man, and he's going to get anxious and antsy when he leaves office. And so this is not going to be the last that you're going to hear of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt will come back on the scene again. But that's it for this time.